All right. So, good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to the first session of the AIM Prime program. Before we get started, just wanted to announce a few things. So, you should have received an invitation to join the session
Sorry, Anmol, we lost you there. Mukta, can you just check? Probably a problem with Anmol. Sorry for the problem. I think we have a little bit of a sound issue there.
Yeah, he's just reconnecting back.
Yeah, apologies for that. Yes, Anmol, we can see you. Let's get started. You can cut off your video if your bandwidth is poor.
Yeah. With that, sorry about the technical issues. So with that, we'll get started. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Anurag Mairal, who will be conducting the session today. A brief introduction. So Dr. Anurag Mairal is uh, an innovator, entrepreneur, and professor. He is the director for global outreach programs at the Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign, and also a faculty at the Stanford University School of Medicine. He is also on the board of various healthcare companies in the Silicon Valley, as well as on the board member of IIT Bombay Heritage Foundation. Uh, so with that, Dr. Anurag Mairal, over to you for the session on need definition. Thank you.
Anmol, can you please unmute Anurag?
Thank you, Anmol, and thank you, Premi, and rest of the Venture Center team for inviting me to this session. I like that you have the control in terms of muting, so that there's not too much of a disturbance. I like that. We have about an hour and 50 minutes today for us to spend time together. And so I would like to make the best use of that time. What I have to share with you, usually I teach that in at least 4 sessions of 2 hours each, sometimes 7 or 8 sessions. And there's a lot of workshops or exercises that are involved in it. What I've chosen to do is I have included all of the slides that I use for those sessions, but I'm only going to go through select number of those slides today. So you'll have those other slides for reference, but I will focus on a select set of slides that are really critical for the concept that I'm going to be talking about. I was invited by Premnath to talk about needs finding as rooted in design thinking in the biodesign methodology that I teach at Stanford, as a starting point for innovation. And I'll go through why that's really important and why it's essential to do some form of needs finding before you really go too deep into the solutions. I will not be focusing too much on the translational part of the journey in our biodesign methodology, which is identify, invent, implement. I will not focus as much on the invent and implement part today. I will focus on identify part, which is the needs identification part of it. I would love to see questions coming from you in the chat window. Even if I'm not able to get to all the questions, it'll help me see where you're coming from, so that I can either respond on the call on the session here, or I can follow up later on in the future. Mechanisms for exchanging ideas amongst us. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, it'll allow me. Just give me a second. Let me do that. There you go. Hope everybody can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Wonderful. And I'm going to turn off this subtitles, which, there you go. Okay. So hopefully this is full screen for all of you. So what I've called here the session is DNA of a Viable Innovation, Needs Finding Rooted in Design Thinking. All of you are innovators, all of you mentor innovators, you incubate innovators, and you want to make sure that amount of effort that innovators are putting in, the whole journey of from a need to a concept to its implementation is such a long journey. And especially in an ecosystem like India, where a lot of things are actually being built right now, we don't have hundreds of years of history or recent history of doing the kinds of technology-based innovation that maybe US and Europe might be more used to. It's important that our innovators basically have really high degree of confidence in the need that they're working on, so that the amount of time that they spend, the years that they spend trying to translate it, they don't come to a point where they realize that the need was mismatched, it was not as well articulated, because then all of the effort that the innovators have put in would actually go down the drain. There's a tremendous intellectual capacity that these innovators have, and you want to make sure that their efforts are focused on the right kind of a need. So that's really the genesis of or the subtext of this discussion. Here's the full agenda, and I'm not going to go through it in great details, all of the sections. There are some sections I'm going to be more partial towards, the ones that I think are most practical and most urgent for you. But I'm going to talk about the design thinking and its history and the biodesign process in particular that I teach at Stanford. And then I'll talk about empathy, which is really a strong starting point for needs finding, and then talk about needs finding itself. How do you do needs definition? How do you come up with a structured need statement that captures all of your learning? And I'll talk about how do you scope these? How do you sort of validate these? How do you come up with criteria so that you can actually then go on to prototyping and concept development? I do recognize that most of the innovators that are on the call, or incubators that are on the call, that have innovators have concepts already, but you can always go back to the needs validation. You can always sort of test and check whether your need was appropriate or not, because iterative development is the name of the game in innovation. And by the way, I've practiced these tools myself in my own innovations. So not just an academic, but also a practitioner of the art. And then I'll talk briefly about how do you look at various filters, various sort of factors that determine what need you ultimately select. One of the key principles of biodesign methodology is that go big and then narrow it down. So identify, do lots of observations and come up with lots of need statements before you pick one. And then you do the same thing with the concept development, come up with lots of concepts that are really wide ranging in lots of different sort of families of solutions, and then select one, because that makes sure that you're not missing anything. And the last but one, the penultimate bullet point here is about looking at existing solutions, looking at the stakeholders, looking at the market, and then selecting needs on the basis of those factors. And so bulk of my time today will be on the third bullet point and the last bullet point. Premnath, one thing I would request you is if you see any questions that are important, please do. I don't have two screens today. I'm doing it from a different place. So please just, interrupt me and ask me any questions that you think I should take on as we are moving forward.
Sure.
I'm trying to be expeditious, but I also don't want to miss any important questions. So I'm just going to play a very quick video as to what is design thinking. Actually, let me, before I do that, let me just ask how many of you have heard of design thinking? My suspicion is most of you, but I just want to do a quick check. If you could just say, yeah, have you heard of yes or no? Have you heard of design thinking before? Have you, practiced design thinking? Have you, attended any sessions on design thinking? It'll be great to understand that, because then that way I will sort of dial my background up and down according to that.
Lots of yeses, Anurag.
Yeah, lots of yeses, which is great. So I'm just gonna skip this slide in that case. I'll come to another slide, another video where I do show the roots of design thinking a bit. But essentially the question here is, why do we need design thinking, right? Three main reasons really are that you don't want to rush to solutions, especially the technology ones. I'm an engineer by training, many of you are likely, and we have this habit of solving the problem. Like we rush to solving. We see a problem, we want to solve it, right? We think we understand the problem fully, and then we just rush to solve it because that's what we're very good at. We're very good at solving problems. That's what we've been taught. We have really strong training in that from our undergraduate days, right? But often it is fraught with this rush that ignores some really important markers. So that rush to solution is what we want to sort of manage. Second is, as I mentioned, the impact of our efforts and resources. You don't want to find 3 years down the road that you miss something really critical in the need. And this is the third one, which is my dad used to say, if you don't know where you're going, you'll get there. What that really means is that if you are not clear about your need and what you're trying to hit as an outcome, you will likely not get that outcome. You'll go somewhere else, basically. So here's the history of design thinking very quickly, because it seems like you all have heard of design thinking, have had some exposure, but it's it's actually it has more than 100 years of history. But most of the real movement in this, in terms of papers and so on, really happened in 50s and 60s. There were some really seminal papers that were written during that time, and then human-centered design became a big thing, especially with the proponents like Steve Jobs and his head of design, and a bunch of other folks, where it was recognized that the design of products must respond to the human needs. And in 1990s, IDEO was formed, which really took that to another level. And Biodesign Program was formed in 2000. Actually, this is our 20th year. And D School, which is at Stanford, which was also founded around the same time, and it has been accompanied by proliferation of design thinking focused programs across the world, and especially business schools. Business schools have just jumped on it, and they have now. I don't think of any top business school that does not have a design thinking program, or any corporation that doesn't have some degree of design thinking being sort of their employees being trained on it. The allure of design thinking has really been how simple the methodology is. If you really think about it, it's really understand the problem before you solve it. That's all design thinking is. Seems very common sense, but it's the rigor of understand the problem before you solve it. That's where we miss out. So what you're going to see today with biodesign methodology is the rigor that helps you sort of really get to the right definition of the need. And we, even in our fellowship, 1-year-long fellowship, we actually spent a ton of time on the needs part. Design thinking is really evolving beyond product design. Of course, there's a sales for sales optimization. There is design thinking there. There's systems thinking, which has been really critical for really complex problems like the COVID situation, for example. So, the principles of design thinking are very valuable, but by no means is it the only methodology, and by no means is it a cure-all. So you have to leverage the needs finding part of it, and leverage the rooting in the unmet needs of the quote unquote user. But in some cases, the user may not be an individual. It could be a whole system, right? Something to keep in mind. So I'm just gonna play a video here. This is what you see here are these 5 steps in design thinking that IDEO founders actually came up with. This is their visual: empathize with a user, define the problem, ideate a solution around it, prototype the solution, and then test it, and then iterate. And that was the name of the game. And I'm just gonna play this video. Hopefully you can hear it. Let's see if I can play this.
Is a 5-step process to come up with.
Can you hear the audio?
We can hear the audio.
Okay.
Meaningful ideas that solve real problems for a particular group of people. The process is taught in top design and business schools around the world. It has brought many businesses lots of happy customers and helped.
Can you also see the video though?
No, we couldn't see the video. I mean, there's
okay. I think yeah, I need to share that screen. My apologies. I'll just share that. Just give me 1 second.
Design thinking is a 5-step process to come up with meaningful ideas that solve real problems for a particular group of people. The process is taught in top design and business schools around the world. It has brought many businesses lots of happy customers and helped entrepreneurs from all around the world to solve problems with innovative new solutions. Step 1. Empathize. The purpose of step 1 is to conduct interviews that give you an idea about what people really care about. We need to empathize with their situation. For example, if you want to help old people, you might find that they want to keep the ability to walk around. In your conversations, they might share with you different ways they can do that. Later into the interview, you'll want to dig a little deeper, look for personal stories or situations where things became difficult. Ideally, you redo the process with many people with the same problem. Step 2. Define the problem. Looking at the interviews, you can now understand the actual needs that people are trying to fulfill with certain activities. One way to do that is to underline the verbs or activities that the people mentioned when talking about their problems, like going for a walk, meeting old friends for tea, or simply going grocery shopping around the corner store. You might realize it's not so much about going out, but more about staying in touch. After your analysis, formulate a problem statement. Some elderly are afraid to be lonely. They want to stay connected. Step 3. Ideate. Now focus only on the problem statement and come up with ideas that solve the problem. The point is not to get a perfect idea, but rather to come up with many ideas, like unique virtual reality experiences, senior-friendly hoverboards, or a modified pushcart. Whatever it is, sketch up your best ideas and show them to the people you are trying to help, so you can get their feedback. Step 4. Prototype. Now take a moment to reflect on what you have learned from your conversations about the different ideas. Ask yourself, how does your idea fit in the context of people's actual lives? Your solution could be a combination of a new idea and what is already being used. Then connect the dots, sketch up your final solution, and go build a real prototype that's just good enough to be tested. Step 5. Test. Now test your prototype with actual users. Don't defend your idea in case people don't like it. The point is to learn what works and what didn't, so any feedback is great. Then go back to ideation or prototyping and apply your learning. Repeat the process until you have a prototype that works and solves the real problem. Now you are ready to change the world or open shop. To experience design thinking firsthand, do the free virtual design thinking crash course from Stanford's D School right now. You will learn to design a new gift-giving experience. Find the link and a guide for this.
Okay. I'm gonna share my slides again. Um, okay. Am I back on with the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, sometimes I have two screens usually, so I know what I'm showing, but I can't do that today. So there's a reason I showed that video, not just because it's from D School and because they ask you to sign up for a course there. Please don't, you don't have to. But the reason I showed that video is because it actually talks about some really key elements. You may have heard the word need in there. You saw in the notes that they had, there's certain parts highlighted. And they talked about how the need was something else while you thought the need was something, right? So it had some really, it was a short, and of course it's not a substitute for the whole thing that we're going to do right now, but it actually does capture many of the important elements. And I just wanted to start with that and sort of go through that a few times, because some of these ideas, with repetition, they actually become far easier to sort of actually implement in practice. So let me now talk about the biodesign process. The biodesign process is basically rooted in design thinking. That's why biodesign. And essentially, it actually takes that 5-step process and includes the implementation part of it and comes up with these 3 major stages. And we call it the 3 I's: the identify, invent, implement. Identify an unmet need, invent a solution around it, and then implement it. The identify and invent parts are usually much faster. Implement part, as many of you know, takes a long time. But if your identify part is not right, your implement part could not only be very long, it could be actually pretty troublesome and could not only be it'll be suboptimal basically, and you could actually fail there, right? So the second thing I want to point out here is that you see a lot of cycles going on within each of these stages. So the needs finding, the identify part has needs finding and needs screening, and it's iterative in nature. Same thing with invent, come up with concepts, concept generation, concept screening, and then same thing with implement. What we are trying to show through this visual is, don't settle on one thing, don't fall in love with one thing. Constantly ask yourself these questions at every stage of identification, need identification, move on to invent. I continue to learn from all the data sources that you can get, and then when you're implementing, continue to pay attention to these things, because you learn quite a bit at every stage, right? You don't know everything when you're beginning this journey. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's also arrows going from, for example, post invent here all the way to identify. These different stages can inform your other stages, and it's important to sometimes go back to the drawing board, even in needs finding. Sometimes you discover something in your invention process that says, wait, this doesn't quite compute, and we got to understand that a little bit more. We got to go back to our stakeholders to do needs finding a little bit more, or needs screening a little bit more. So that's something that and it's hard. This is, the rigor, this kind of rigor is hard to do. And, it's one thing to do this in a university setting like Stanford or an IIT, but actually doing this in practice when you have funding challenges, human resource challenges, all of those things that are going on, it's very, very hard to do. It's the mindset though that I'm encouraging you all to have, even if you don't sit down and spend a year doing this. So, we teach this to our fellows, our faculty, our global fellows and faculty. There's a Stanford Biodesign Program that we started 14 years back, but it's expanded to other global geographies across Asia Pacific, Europe, and Africa. We have our students where we teach these classes, our researchers, and the industry as well. The industry actually participate in these executive training programs. So it's a broad set of learners that learn this methodology. I'm just going to quickly go through the steps in the biodesign methodology. First one is needs finding. Here, you start by identifying as many needs as you can, and that numbers are really important. By the time our fellows have finished their needs finding, they have hundreds of needs sometimes, and then they articulate those needs, each of those needs. And then when they're done, they actually articulate them using the statement here. And this needs statement is really, really critical part of needs finding. And you are all actually going to do an exercise on it. So I do want you to pay attention to this one. And it is the needs statement is basically three parts to it. First part is the problem, second part is the population, third part is the outcome. So a way to solve the problem X in a population Y in order to achieve an outcome Z. That's basically the need statement architecture. Here's an example of that. A way to perform point of care testing. So performing of point of care testing is the problem. This is for relating to oncology, where diagnostics of cancers, especially skin lesions, which is the focus here, typically happens with an oncologist, and most of the problems show up much earlier. And by the time you get diagnosed with it, it's already too late for that skin cancer. So this was a problem that the team identified with a way to perform point of care testing. That's the problem. Population, which population? Patients who have skin lesions. Patients, we don't know whether patients have cancer yet or not. We want to make sure they don't have cancer. We want to eliminate that. Those who have cancer, we want to rush them to oncologists. And those who don't have cancer, we don't want to waste their time and healthcare systems time doing anything else. So we want them to go back to, just with some cream or whatever, right? So the population is patients with skin lesions, very well defined. And this last part is really critical. In order to achieve what? There was a very specific outcome that the team realized that they want to accomplish. And that was enabling accurate, inexpensive diagnosis. Not just screening, diagnosis, which is like a higher threshold, right? Of what? Of malignant melanoma. They had a very clear disease that they wanted to identify, because this is high death rate, high mortality rate if it's not found early on, and by a dermatologist. This is critical too. Not by an oncologist, but by a dermatologist, because most patients actually after they've dealt with a primary care physician end up going to a dermatologist because they have a skin problem that is persistent, that bothers them. So that outcome was very, very well defined. And in many cases, in most cases, outcomes are measurable. It's an outcome that somebody is willing to pay for it. So there are a number of factors that go into defining a good outcome. So if you think about it, it's a very structured needs statement. It took a lot of time for them to actually get to this. But once they had it, they were very clear what their North Star was, what problem that this team was trying to solve. And then they just went after it, and then they were able to come up with a solution, and they ultimately were able to commercialize it. Another example, this is completely from a different field, not from a healthcare field. This was about food insecurity, a way to reduce food insecurity in families of high school students who are in underserved communities. So these are students who are in these poor families, and that food insecurity actually impacts their graduation rate. So here the outcome was enabling higher graduation rate, because that had a major impact on their economic capacity in the future and their health in the future and so on. So this was a need statement for a completely different kind of a need. Okay, any questions on this? Let me pause here, because this is such an important part of the session today. I want to make sure that we respond, that we take any questions. Any questions about the need statement structure itself? Does it make sense? Okay, all right. Seems like
There's a question
yeah,
there. When someone works on a material that could solve several problems, like example graphene, what do you do? So this is more of a, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So that's an interesting question. So here you are talking about a technology that you have, and you are asking, how do you pick which problem you want to solve? And that's a great question. That often happens when you have specific you're an engineering professor and you are a materials professor and you or material researcher and you got a really interesting material in this case, right? And you want to apply it. You've got a range of applications from aerospace to medicine and so on. What I would recommend is actually you do the needs finding in each of those areas. You do a first set of screens to figure out which need areas are most promising, in terms of the industry, in terms of your fit of this technology with that space. And then you do a deeper needs finding, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, where you actually do interviews, you do observations, and you make lots and lots of notes. And from that come up with need statements. And then you validate those need statements and then you screen them. I think that's the way to do it. You basically let them compete. The key element of design thinking and by design methodology, of course, is that you let the needs compete and you pick the best need, because you want to make sure that your efforts are going in the right direction. You get the ROI for that, right? So you want them to compete. So it's great that you have all of these different potential applications, but craft these need statements based on deep research, needs finding exercise on those need areas, and let them compete. And there's a way. I'm gonna end with how do you select the top need, because there's an art and science to that as well.
Anurag, there's another question on how do you write a need statement when you're it's a B2B kind of an issue where the outcome is for the customer of the business.
Yeah, you can state that. You can actually very clearly mention that. You can include that so that the customer can achieve this. Absolutely. You can include that in the outcomes. As long as your problem and the solution to that problem can impact that directly. If you see that connection directly. So I'll give you an example. I'm on the advisory board of an AI company called Viz AI. Now they have an AI solution that actually moves patients through the stroke care pathway, so that patients can get to a mechanical thrombectomy, which is a major medtech solution for acute ischemic stroke, for large vessel occlusions. It can save lives, actually. Remarkable technology, right? Now, their need is to get patients to mechanical thrombectomy centers as quickly as possible, so that a lot more mechanical thrombectomy interventions can take place. Now, the mechanical thrombectomy intervention is for their client. They are not getting anything from it, but they want to accomplish that outcome for their client.
Yeah. There's another question, Anurag, which refers to, does the need statement also, if the population is too small and the paying capacity is less, then should one drop the problem? Well, that's a slightly, I think, probably jumping ahead, but nonetheless, you can address.
No, I think we'll talk about needs screening. So that's an important question, right? So when we do the needs screening, that's you choose your criteria, what criteria, and what you just said is definitely one of the criteria. It's one of the important criteria, actually. Yes, you do. So you let them compete based on urgency and the size of the problem, your ability to actually solve the problem. There are a number of factors that go into it, and it's iterative in nature. So yeah, if you have another alternative need that serves a larger population in a more urgent way, you'll probably end up picking that.
Another question is, does the need statement also need evaluation, validation, iterations, or we do it only while defining solutions?
No, you don't want to. So you're going to hear this from me. And in fact, let me just show you. I think I have that in the screen here. There you go. No solutions allowed. Do not. So all your needs finding and need statement drafting and need screening, everything must happen. If you remember that there was identify, invent, implement, everything must happen in identify. You can go back to it when you're doing invention. Sometimes you can go back to it, but the majority of the work has to be done upfront. So all of that must happen in that stage. Don't move on to the concepts at all. And by the way, this is a very classic problem with us engineers. We see a problem, we want to solve it, right? We start to get great ideas. One of the biggest things that when I'm teaching this to students and different learners, even very senior learners, they start going straight to the solution. Their need statement ends up embedding a solution. One of the flaws in need statements can be you embed a solution in there. You don't want to do that. Be very, very agnostic to the solution. Focus on the need, because then you're not going to bring your biases into it. Like even the graphene example, I would actually not bring graphene at all in there. I would actually understand which areas you want to apply and then identify unmet needs. And then when you're prioritizing it, you figure out whether you have an ability to solve it. If it requires a different kind of technology and you don't have access to it, that need goes away.
Sure, I think we should continue.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think.
Sorry, there is another question. If you don't mind, I'll just put that down there.
Sure.
Which came on YouTube. The particular need statement has an inbuilt solution, a POC device. How do we scope up or scope down a need statement?
Great question. Sometimes you can. So what happens is there's a term called the trunk needs and the branch needs. This is that I use. We have a visual that looks like it. There's a trunk statement and a branch need statement. Sometimes when you are really focusing on fixing something that is wrong with the current solution, like there's a major gap, like something like your X-ray machines are too big and you want to make them small, right? You're obviously really focusing on the X-ray machines, right? So you could then zoom in your need statement to that. But when the need statement is too big picture or too trunk, sometimes it becomes very hard to actually do it. It's much easier to take an existing solution and tweak it and make it better than to come up with a completely new solution to a problem. And so you have to dial that up and down depending on how ambitious you are. Do you feel that you have the ability to solve that problem at the trunk level, or do you feel that you have to zoom in to a branch level, which may sometimes be embedded in an existing solution? So it's I think your resources, your ability to impact it. But generally speaking, if you can solve a trunk need, that's the ideal thing, because that's when you make the greatest impact. That's when you make the most amount of money.
I think we should continue, Anurag.
Sounds good. So second part is need screening, which again, same thing, have screen them based on the basis of the set criteria. And we talked about some of those criteria. And screening approach can be based on the disease state, about existing solutions, key stakeholders, what the market looks like. But you progressively eliminate. If you notice that there are multiple stages in which you're screening. In fact, most of our teams actually do 3 or 4 filtered screens by the time they get to their final need statement. And again, very iteratively. And then for the very top needs, let's say you come up with top 2 or 3 or 4 needs, you should have a needs criteria, which includes must have. You absolutely must have in that need. And this is another pitfall that innovators have. They dump everything into the need. One of my mentee teams actually had a neonatal solution, which basically did everything that they saw as a need in the neonatal ICU. But the problem was that the nurses, they only care about 1 or 2 things. That having all of those features in the solution actually made things harder for them. The thing would go off, alarm would go off all the time, and so on. So you have to figure out. You have to be very disciplined about what are your must-have criteria and what are your nice to have. And when you're designing a solution, you really need to focus on must-have, and then you can always add bells and whistles through nice to have. And that discipline is very, very difficult, by the way. And then the third stage, which is in the second, part of it, the invent part of it, the concept generation. Lots and lots of ideas. You commit lots of ideas, and then you screen them similarly to the need screening process. And you filter based on a number of these factors: intellectual property, regulatory pathway, reimbursement, business model, and so on. And once you've done that in multiple iterations, you come up with your final concept. And that is when you really start your long journey of implementation. But if you've done your needs identification really well, if you've done your invention process really well, implementation would be much, much more expeditious and effective. And there are a number of factors that you consider when you're doing an implementation plan, and we're not going to focus on it today, so I'm skipping that. Let me get to empathy, which is a really central piece to needs finding. And I think it's something that us engineers tend not to have too much of. I think liberal arts people do. So we need a little bit of coaching here, right? And mentoring here. What is empathy? Empathy is different from sympathy. Sympathy is when you're thinking of yourself as an outsider, and then you're looking at somebody else, and you're looking at as an outsider and trying to sort of sympathize with the individual. Whereas empathy is basically, it's really an action of understanding and being sensitive to the users or the stakeholders who you're talking about, their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences. Each of these words actually is really important, because when you're doing needs finding, that becomes really critical. their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences, something that can be communicated explicitly may not even be able to be communicated explicitly. So when we do an exercise in a few minutes, I want you to pay attention to both what's said and what's not said. Okay. And empathy and design thinking, it's like at the root. It's like the basis of needs finding. Basically, you need to understand your user, and you may say, well, if its system is the user, like in the case of a healthcare system, or in an economic system, whatever, how do you empathize with it, right? Well, empathize doesn't just mean emotionally empathize. I mean, it also means you understand how each of the stakeholders that makes that ecosystem, makes that quote unquote user, how do they collectively think? It's harder to do, but I think it's still a worthwhile exercise, because when you understand that really well, you can root your problems in that pretty well. So basically, empathy and design thinking is really about deep understanding of the problems and realities, the people we're designing for, people or systems we're designing for. Not only about what is explicitly articulated, but whatever is latent needs and desires. So we really need to understand their environment, users' environment, and their roles and their interaction in that environment. Okay, so when you're trying to basically leverage empathy in design thinking, you want to see what the user's world from their eyes. You want to appreciate them and have that respect. You want to understand their feelings, and you want to communicate what your understanding is, and that's a really critical final step in it. I'm going to do an exercise with you guys, which is very interesting. And normally I do that as a pair, but I'm going to have the teams do this. So teams, we're not going to do a breakout session, but my hope is that teams can chat with each other through chat. And basically what I want you to do is have one of your team members pretend like a customer. And basically I want you to interview that team member as a customer, basically try and understand what the needs of that customer are. Now, it's very hard to do when you're not face-to-face. It's very hard to do when you're not in a breakout session. It's very hard to do that through a chat, but let's see if we can give it a try. And I'll give you 5 minutes. What I want you to come back with is a empathy map, where you have a 2x2 on a piece of paper, what they're saying, what they're doing, and what they're thinking and what they're feeling. I want you to imagine your customers and actually write this down. Or maybe actually since we are not doing a breakout session, maybe each of you do this individually. Don't do that as a team, because I think that's going to be hard to do. So each of you just think about your customers. Each of you grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, and draw this 2x2, okay? And think of those customers and your conversations with those customers, and write down a few bullet points on the say quadrant. Like what do your customers say? What would they say if you talk to them? What would they do? Would they be uncomfortable about certain things? Would they fidget? Would they sort of be animated about certain things? And then on the first quadrant on the right on top, what might they be thinking and what might they be feeling in the fourth quadrant? Just one or two bullet points. It doesn't have to be very extensive, and I'll give you 5 minutes. So we're not doing it as a team. I take it back. We're doing it as individuals because that's probably most expeditious. Just grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, and write down 1 or 2 bullet points on those. Think from the customer's perspective. Don't think from your perspective. Put yourself in the shoes of the customer. Okay. And I would like some examples in 5 minutes. So our time starts now.
So Anurag, each of the teams, there are teams, and each of them have one company, at least startup, right?
Yeah.
They will have some customers in mind.
Yes.
Right? And probably they can do it with that in mind, and probably list in the chat box a few of these under say, think, do, and feel, right?
Yeah. That'll be great. I like that idea, Premnath. The only thing I didn't know was whether these teams were physically together. If they're all separately and they're joining Zoom from their homes, I realized that
all of us are separate. So
exactly. So just do this individually, but do what Premnath suggested, which is think of your customer. and pick anything. It doesn't matter if you have multiple customers, pick one customer. It's an exercise that I want you to do because it's a muscle that builds when you practice it. And what I really care about is what you took out from them based on what they're thinking or what they're feeling, because in those thinking and feelings are unmet needs. And you saw that in the video that I showed 15 minutes earlier. 4 more minutes.
Anurag, I've just said that they can type in a few points. Okay.
Yeah.
So that
you can start typing in if you already come up with, what they are thinking, what they are feeling. Just start typing, whatever bullet points come to you. And I'll pick a few examples, and maybe you can help me with that, Premnath, to I convert that into a need statement, like an unmet need, not a full need statement, but a hint of a need, basically, from your empathy of your customers.
Sure. For example, Sandeep Shetty is talking about his customer being the elderly people. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to empathize and understand what they think they're saying, what they think they are thinking, what you think they're thinking, what you think they're doing, and what you think they're feeling.
Right. So Sandeep, let me scratch the surface there. So elderly people, are they thinking that they want other old people around them? What they feel lonely? They need help with their health. Yeah. So that's what you want to start. You want to start to get into their minds. What are they feeling? What are they thinking? Because that'll help you figure out whether they need a home, or they just need to be wherever they are, and they just need a way of them getting together for a game of bingo every night. I'm just making it up, but you want to understand what their thinking and feeling is, their feelings are. Is the customer assumed to be same as the user? Sometimes the users are different from customers, because customers are the ones who are actually paying for it. Users could be somebody else. You could do this exercise for either. Often in design thinking, the user and customer are assumed to be the same, but in healthcare, for example, they are different. So you can pick. I think user is probably easiest to empathize with, but you should empathize with the customer also, because they are the ones who are paying ultimately. So my recommendation would be, ultimately, when you're doing it for your business, do it for the customer. Okay, Minds Owner solution for low grade ores. I mean, that's what are they thinking about? What are they feeling, those Minds Owners, Ashok? That's something that you want to actually get into their mind. I'm pushing you guys to get into their minds. This mind owner, think of a minority owner you spoke with, okay? And think of what were they thinking, what they feeling. If you talk to them about their problems, what problems were they presenting, or what What were they like? Oh, it's such a painful thing. This mines, the whole bureaucratic thing has become so much, and it's just not worth it to run these mines, right? Or we are so old-fashioned about everything in mines. It's just very inefficient. You want to get into their minds basically as much as possible.
Yeah. So there is Tulsi runs an incubator, so she's taken her customer as an incubator. Okay, so you say it's, what they're saying is they need smooth functioning and thinking that timelines will not be met. Okay, those are some thoughts there.
Those are great. Those are great because right there you're starting to get the contours of a need. So what happens is when you get into people's minds and the organization's minds or customers' minds, you start to understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, because we are all organizations also run by people. So there is a thinking and there is a feeling, of the stakeholders within that organization. So you pick a stakeholder that represents that organization and you basically try and get into their minds basically, because it represents the organization in a way. And then that actually starts to give you a sense of what the needs might be. And this becomes the starting point for your needs finding. Okay. So I'm going to move on in the interest of time because we have only an hour left. I do want to get to the needs finding, which is a key part of it. So let me talk about the fundamentals of needs finding. There are 3 dimensions of need we talked about: way to solve problem X in population Y in order to achieve outcome Z. And we saw an example. This was a food insecurity problem, and outcome was higher graduation rate for high schoolers. This video I'm going to skip in the interest of time, but this is a really useful video where Paul York, our founder and outgoing director, basically talks about how do you do background research, how do you do observations, how do you do interviews, how do you sort of do needs expression. I will talk a little bit about each of these in a minute, but essentially those are 3 ways that you do needs exploration. I just asked you to do a bit of an empathy thing, right? Normally, I would have you do that live in person with another user in front of you, another customer in front of you. So that's interviews, right? But you can actually get to some insights through background research as well. There's tremendous amount of insight in the background materials as well, whether watching YouTube video or reading an article or whatever it might be, right? Or reports or whatever. So that's another way. And there's a third way, which is our preferred way at Biodesign, and it complements these other 2. So background research, interviews, but also observations. And what do we mean by observations? It's really being a fly on the wall. You're not talking to anybody. You're not asking them. You're watching them. Can somebody tell me on the chat what's the difference between observations and interviews? What do you get from observations, being on the fly on the wall, that you don't get from the interviews? What's that one thing that you don't get from the interviews? What do you think? Yeah, celebration. Okay. Any other thoughts? What they feel? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think you guys are you're pretty warm here. Basically, in the interviews, the latent needs. There's a term called latent needs. Latent needs and needs that are hidden. People sometimes can't tell you exactly what they need. Remember this famous saying from Ford is that if I asked people what they needed, they would have said a faster horse. You know what he was talking about? Ford was the innovator of Model T, which revolutionized automotive industry. Automotives were there before, but he basically made them accessible to everybody. And he came up with the Model T, and he said, I didn't really ask people what they needed. I actually observed them, and I realized what their needs were. If I had asked them, they would have said, I need a horse who is faster. I need a horse who can go longer without eating too much. I need a horse who, whatever, right? I mean, so everything would have been rooted in the current unmet needs. So the latent needs can only be obtained through observations. So you want to observe, you want to see what they're doing, you want to see where they're struggling. And because in healthcare, for example, I deal with this all the time. Surgeons say they got it covered. They're doing brain surgery. They know exactly how to do it. They've mastered it, and they think there's no need. I mean, there's no need to change anything because they have mastered it, right? Turns out that they have just found ways around the problems that they encountered. Those problems are now embedded in their practice. Observation would help you figure that out. Okay, so those three approaches for needs finding, for exploration, you want to do a lot of background research, you want to do a lot of interviews, and you want to do observations, be fly on the wall. Okay, and this video actually talks a little bit about that. I'm going to skip the next video also, which is from David Kelly. He talks about rules of observation. What are the key rules of observation? When you're observing, so there's of course background research and there's interviews, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. How do you interview? What sort of questions you are? How do you ask the questions? You don't ask, closed-ended questions basically. But rules of observation, let's just talk about that. When you're observing, you shouldn't judge. You should keep an open mind. You don't, let's say you're focusing on obesity. Don't observe and see this, overweight person is basically his or her own enemy. He or she is eating too much. You're jumping to conclusion. You're jumping to where you think the problem is. Be open. Maybe the person is fat because doesn't really eat that much. It's just got a biological problem, right? So don't judge. Be truly, truly curious. Question everything. Don't take anything for granted, because that's where a lot of needs fall through. Find patterns. When you see like 10 different people actually articulating same thing in multiple different ways, that's a pattern, right? And then listen, really pay attention and watch, basically observation, right? So those are rules of observation. What are some of the important clues that you're looking for in the observation? You're looking at pain, their stress. They talk about time and inconvenience, or you see their time and inconvenience. I'll give you an example. We did a needs finding with a GI surgeon in Raipur, Chhattisgarh, and they had a pipeline basically of patients coming in, and the GI surgeon was doing the endoscopy on these patients. Their main issue was really how quickly can they disinfect this endoscope so that they can actually take on the next patient, because volume and the speed was really critical for him and his team. So time and convenience was really critical. The setup was they had like tubs of these things where they had different solutions that they were disinfecting with, but it was inconvenient because things could fall, liquid could fall through. So this is where inconvenience was a factor, right? You look for risks, you look for uncertainty. If they're not sure about something and when customer is doing something, the dogma, they're like repeatedly doing certain things without, or there's a stigma that you see, right? In mental health, for example. So these are the different clues that you look for when you're doing observation. And what are the must-dos when you're doing an observation? You absolutely must write down date, time, place. You should know who's around, because that creates the environment. You want to write down specific facts, numbers that come up. Oh, he says, oh, we see 12 customers every day, and last during the pandemic the number has gone down to 2, right? So remember, write down specific facts, numbers, details, and your perception, your impression of the sounds, signs and smell, and how are people, like if let's say the environment is very noisy and somebody having to speak loudly doing the activity, that's an observation, right? So you want to write that down, the sensory impressions. How are they reacting to the observations, the stakeholders? If there's specific quotes are very, very valuable. They might say something that, like, when people say something, there's so much value in it. You write that down. You're not interviewing them, but they're saying something in the course of an observation. Write that down. Timing of various steps, that could be an interesting way of articulating the gap, and the questions that emerge in your mind. You don't ask them that. You're not doing interviews. You're doing observation. But if it comes to your mind, if a question comes up, you should make a note of it. And this comes to the interview part. So we talked about observations. I'll talk about interviews, and then I'll take some questions. You should always ask them why. I mean, first of all, when you start the interviews, you should always start with the most big picture questions. Don't ask them yes/no questions ever. Encourage them to tell a story. Encourage them to tell a story of a specific instance, because in that specific instance, are hidden clues of the gaps or the unmet needs. Look for inconsistencies. They may say something one time, something another. They may not do it deliberately, but there may be inconsistency in the way they're relating to their story, right? Look at nonverbal cues, the grimace, the frustration, that stress on the face. When you're interviewing folks, and if they're silent, don't just fill that in with a prompt. Sometimes silence is good because you're reflecting upon, you're making them go back to their need, and you want to, you want them to actually reflect upon it, and that silence actually can lead to some interesting responses afterwards. And don't prompt answers, because then you're feeding your ideas into their mind, and that's not what you want. And the last part that I said, yes, no questions, no binary questions, because then you are really shutting down the conversation. So, I'm going to pause here for a second and see if there are any questions around needs exploration. The three methodologies that we talked about: background research, which gives you a lot of insight into the unmet needs, interviews, and observations. Live observations as a fly on the wall. Any questions?
Anurag, question, would it help to use all three, or one technique better than the another for certain
All three, they're all complementary.
startups?
They're all complementary.
Yeah, and does it change for the kind of different problems people are addressing, or the kind of startups that they're working on, and so on?
It does, but the reason we like observations a lot is because it tells you stuff that interviews and background research can't. Background research is very dry. It's basically been distilled down by somebody else. So it's somebody else's lens on the problem, right? On the gap, on the unmet need. So you should still use it. I mean, people will articulate it, so you should benefit from it. But you should build upon that through your own interviews. And the observations really add a very unique layer that's very hard to come by with the background research and interviews. So yeah, but I think in certain cases, one methodology might be more preferred than the other, but I would recommend that you try all three.
And how does this process change if there's a user and a paying customer are different? And should we do observations for both? Like you can take maybe an example of a medical product where, very often users and payers can be different, right?
Agreed. So let's say you have a consumer type of a health medical technology, right? Let's say it's a glucose monitor. Now your customer is your clinician who is prescribing that glucose monitor to the patient. So you definitely want to do your needs finding with them, but you also need to do needs finding with the customer, because with the user, because they're going to be using this device at home, and if they have a problem, it comes back to your customer, right? So in this case, even though the customer users are different, you need both their perspectives in your unmet need. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
There's a question about what if people don't directly need it, like someone wants to buy an EV, but they might later need charging, right? So they don't maybe perceive the need at that time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What happens in those cases?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So you have to, when you're doing interviews with them, you want to take them to that place. You want to create a thought experiment for them, and you make them think about it, make them sort of put themselves in that situation and think about it, and then evoke a response from them. This is an example, Premnath, where an interview method is actually important, because you are trying to get them to a particular place. Since they are not in that setting, you can't observe them, right? I mean, you could observe them as to how they're using their EV, and what are they doing about recharging that EV. You could just sort of do an observation of that, and then that'll actually reveal at what point do they really feel the need. Or you can actually, when you're doing the interview, you take them there hypothetically.
Yeah, I think you should continue, but there's one clarification we should do here, which is Tulsi had asked if observation is during the interview or it is separate, right? And
it's separate. It's separate. Yeah. Because when you're interviewing, you're directly talking to them, right? You can't observe. So when I say observations, what I really mean by that is being fly on the wall, literally being fly on the wall. Like now you're not interacting with the environment enough to change the behavior of the environment. You want that to be as pristine as possible. Ideally, if there's a glass wall between you and them, but that's hard to do. So you sit in that setting, but you make yourself as inconspicuous as possible.
Just like some of your fellows say, sit and watch operations happening in an operation theater without, any comment, interview, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. I think you should continue, please.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of these slides because of the time. Preparing to engage stakeholders, you really want to understand your stakeholder group. Really critical. In fact, I normally do an exercise. I won't do it today, but you want to really map out your stakeholder map. You want to figure out what is the relationship between these stakeholders with your customers, because that'll help you sort of really figure out, because these stakeholders are very important for adoption of your solution. Ultimately, you're going to go back to these people. You want to know who makes decisions. You can have a table where you can say what roles do they play, who makes the decisions around buying, who makes the decisions on using, who informs whom. I'll give you an example. Typically, when you're buying a car, you typically think of man of the house, which is in a typical household. Man of the house actually, does all the research and then sort of may write the check at the end. But sometimes the kids actually are the ones who basically end up saying, we want this color, or we want this kind of a model, so you have to understand your stakeholder groups basically, right? So that's really, really critical. And you want to map that out. And here's a good example of a map. And there's a link that I've included, and you should go and check that out. You want to do this exercise, and you want to keep on improving your understanding. And that map can evolve over a period of time. There could be a general map. There could be a very specific map for your type of unmet need. Okay. How to map stakeholders. I'm going to skip this for now, but it's a very important exercise. So, and I'm going to skip this exercise in the interest of time. Actually, let me just take 2 minutes though. I'm sorry, I was going to sneeze. I won't do the exercise, but can you write in the chat window your list of stakeholders? Who are your stakeholders? Who are your most important stakeholders? And be expansive. Don't limit it to just one or two. I know that each of your unmet needs that you're trying to solve, there are 8, 10 stakeholders potentially. So can you please type in the chat window stakeholders that customers are deal with, that you're the target market that you're focusing on, or target problem that you're focusing on involves. No, not generic. For your unmet need. You're all, if you have, who are your customers and who are their stakeholders? Just the names of the stakeholders. Tanners, yes. CSR partners, mentors, academia, startups, yes. OEMs, patients, cleft patients, yes. Scientists, researchers, lab managers, yep. Okay, asthma patients, family members, family physicians, medical service providers, yes, absolutely. Yeah, chemical industry is too broad, so there may be more stakeholders associated with. So what I would, these are great. Actually, I see that you are really putting a lot of thoughts, and I already see that you are actually going beyond just one stakeholder group that you may think is important, which is exactly the purpose of this. I see the list is getting longer and longer, which is exactly what I'm suggesting, because we miss out when you don't fully articulate all your stakeholders, you miss out on their influences and their action, their influence on the problem that you're trying to solve. And these stakeholders will ultimately come in the way of, or would be supportive of your solution. You want to make sure that you neutralize the resistance. I'll give you an example. One of my fellow professors had a brilliant solution for obstructive sleep apnea. It was a patch. And he worked with some thought leaders, and the data was great. And when the product came to market, there was half the sleep medicine doctors just fiercely opposed it. That CPAP is the way to go. we don't want to compromise on that. We don't want to go through this new innovative solution. Basically, though that stakeholder group was completely unanticipated, and that actually led to less optimal success of that product. So you want to really be very expansive in your articulation of who your stakeholders are. Some of these stakeholders may not be important, but you want to know that they exist, and you can rank order them. You can put them into 3 categories: very critical, they have a decision-making role; important because they have a supportive role and enabling role; and then a last group of ones which you want to just watch. Make sure that they are not coming in the way or something, or they're informing it basically. So I'm going to move on. Once you have your list of stakeholders, you prioritize, figure out which ones do you want to observe, which ones do you want to interview, and which ones do you want to research more background research on. And here are some guidelines as to what you need to do to prepare for that. But I'm going to skip the details of it right now. Let's talk about needs definition and needs statement. I'm repeating, by the way, this slide that shows up, I repeat it, it's not by accident. I'm deliberately, the subliminal messaging. There are 3 parts to a needs statement: problem, population, outcome. Even if you don't end up writing a needs statement for your problem, I do encourage you to write needs statement for your problem. Whoever is working on a solution right now, whether you're an incubator or an actual innovator, you need to write down your needs statement. If you cannot articulate your problem in a needs statement, that means you're not really your problem well enough. It's a great tool to actually figure out whether you're on the right track or not. But even if you don't come up with a need statement, do think about what problem you're solving. Do think about which population you're solving it for, and you do think about what outcome you ultimately want. That's why I'm just repeating it. If this is the only thing you take away from this entire session, my job is done. Okay. I'm going to skip the details of this, but there's something called the problem outcome connection. Remember, I said there's a problem, there's population, there's outcome, right? You can come up with lots of different need statements. You can come up with a range of need statements based on problem outcome pair. So here are 2 need statements where the same sort of gap that my team observed in the field, where ER, the emergency vehicle, the AMT was responding to a trauma victim or trauma victims, and they came up with these 2 different need statements basically. So the first one says a way to reduce the time required for unskilled medical practitioners to place an endotracheal tube in the emergency setting. Patients are bleeding, they are not able to breathe, and they could die. So you place an endotracheal tube to allow them to breathe, but they are unskilled medical practitioners, right? These EMT folks are not medical practitioners. So how do you reduce the time? How do you quickly do it so that patient can start breathing soon and can survive? But that same need area, or same general need, is actually restated in another need statement: a way for unskilled medical practitioners to place an endotracheal tube in an emergency setting without a drop in oxygen saturation. So outcomes is what's different here. In the first case, the outcome was time required for placement. In the second one is the outcome is drop in oxygen saturation. You want the drop in the oxygen saturation to be arrested within a certain band. Actually, in each case, the solution would be very different. Same sort of need, but different problem outcome pairing. And your innovation, your solution to these 2 will be very different. It could be same. They could something you could come up with something that could address both equally well. But generally speaking, careful pairing is important. And when you're doing your needs filtration, you would end up prioritizing one over the other depending on which one do you think is going to lead to greatest impact in this need area. Okay. All right. So here are some measures of outcomes. If you want help in thinking about how you think about these outcomes, if you're in healthcare, you think about treatment success rate, rate of adverse events, total cost, time resources required, frequency and occurrence of treatment. Those are all sort of measures of outcome. For non-medical kind of situations, it could be increased number of underserved treated, high number of people with access to food, higher graduation rate we talked about earlier, in a higher number of person nights underneath a roof. These are for people who are homeless. So basically, it's just a range of outcomes, but you want desired outcomes. So left side is the desired outcomes, and right side is how you're measuring this by. You want your outcomes to be measurable. You don't want your outcomes to be so vague that you cannot measure it, because you'll never know whether you're hitting the mark or not, right? So in a need statement, you will have improved health equity in terms of increased number of whatever, right? So that's how you would state your outcome. So let me pause here and see if this makes sense, this problem outcome pairing and the role of outcome in a need statement. Any questions?
Sorry, Anurag, there were only some comments between the two statements which you had put down to outcomes. People were trying to understand and compare the two. But there's one question on which the question states, can we measure before testing? Okay, but I suppose the question is more to do with quantifying the measure, right?
Yeah.
Rather than stating the measure. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think I don't see too many questions over here which are relevant.
Okay. All right. That's good. So I'm gonna skip this next slide. This is really about right zoom level. There was a question earlier from the audience which I really liked about what should be the zoom level, and I talked about tree versus the branch versus trunk, and so I think that I'll let that comment stand, and this slide you can review it later on. So here's an exercise I want you to do now. Okay, this is the moment of truth for all of you. I want each of you, again, we can't split into teams, like we don't have enough time, we can't do Zoom breakout sessions right now. So each of you individually, and you don't have 3 need statements, just one need statement for the problem that you're trying to solve. What is the problem? Who has that problem? What is the outcome we want? So the three components of the need statement: a way to solve problem X in population Y in order to achieve outcome Z. Okay. So please, in the chat window, in the next 5 minutes, I'll give you a few minutes to think about it. But if you already have a need statement written down, please type in the chat window. And I would like one from everyone, because that's really the objective of this whole exercise. So I would love to see a need statement for the problem that you're trying to solve. And it should be structured in the manner that I've recommended. A way to solve problem X. Don't embed the solution in there, okay? A way to solve problem X for population Y in order to achieve an outcome. So think about each of those and craft that need statement. So problem statement and need statement are the same. Problem is part of the need statement. But need statement has other things in there as well. A way to address hand hygiene in healthcare workers. Okay, so you got healthcare workers is the population, hand hygiene is the problem. In order to reduce hospital acquired. That's a really good, that's a well-written need statement. Kalpit, you must be an experienced biodesigner. I'm kidding, but that's actually a well-written need statement. Sandeep, Shardul has a way to reduce frequent symptom flare-ups in asthma patients. So asthma patients is the population in order to gain control over their health. See, in order to control your health, that's not measurable. So Shardul, you really want to think about an outcome that can be measured. So think of a measure for that. It's a good outcome, but think of an outcome that can be more measurable. Because then somebody will pay for it. Also, that's the other thing. You want an outcome that's measurable, so that you can do a clinical study around it, you can do some evidence gathering, and then you want an outcome that somebody will pay for it. Okay, those are the two very interesting guidelines for coming with outcomes. So Nitin, what you have is a solution here. One-stop center for integrated incubation support to pharma and healthcare. What you want to say is that need for you may want to think about that gap a little bit. What is the gap that you're solving, right? One-stop center is a solution. What's the gap that you're solving? So you may want to think about that. So you want to reframe that a little bit. But I think I understand where you're going with that, actually. These are all very, very good need statements, actually. A way to develop which is eco-benign for use in laser processing in order to achieve the required purpose without impacting the environment. So, Aravindan, that you're embedding that in a current solution potentially, but I see where you're coming from. It. So, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to actually go through each of these. I would love to dig into this and sort of provide more feedback, but you're getting the idea. I think most of you have the right structure. And then you want to ask yourself, am I truly framing the problem, or am I embedding the solution in there? Because you will have a bias. I guarantee that you will have a bias. You will frame your need statement to introduce problem in the solution that you already have in mind in some way. That discipline is very hard. So I'm going to, if I were working with you, I would push you to sort of iterate on the need statement to make it as pure play. Your solution could ultimately be the same solution that you, it will be the same one, but you want that need statement to be bereft of the actual solution that you have, generally speaking, unless you're doing a branch need statement. Vaibhav, a technology that starts with a solution. So you want to frame that as a need, as a gap, rather than as a solution. Okay. Okay. All right. I think I see. Great exercise. Thank you so much. I think thanks for humoring me on this one. I love the way you approached it. I provide some feedback. I'm happy to in the future, if there is an opportunity, I'm happy to provide more detailed feedback. Is there a way to capture these chat messages, Premnath? Because some of these would be useful to go back to.
Anmol, you can save the chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I would like to ask you, when you're done with this entire program, what's your need statement at the end? Is it the same one that you started with here, or has it evolved? My hope is that it does evolve. Okay. All right. So need scoping and validation. We got about, let me see how much time we have left. 30 minutes. So need scoping, validation, and criteria. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a light touch on it, but they are very important. You want to scope your need really well. When you're prioritizing, especially, when you're coming with need statements, you come up with a range of need statements. Don't just zoom in onto only one need, right? I asked you to come up with a need statement, one need statement, because I wanted to see how you structure it. But generally, when you're writing it down in an Excel spreadsheet, you should have dozens of need statements, hundreds if, in some cases, but let's say at least dozens. And those could be the same need being articulated based on different scoping, zoomed in, zoomed out, with different problem outcome pairs. You can play with it. Come up with as many need statements as you can, and then use filters to prioritize them. That exercise is very, very useful. You're going to find them very illuminating when you do that. It's a fun exercise, and you don't need to spend a lot of time doing it. Actually, if you've done enough needs finding, if you've done enough observations, enough interviews, background research, it should be a pretty straightforward exercise for you. But essentially, you want to test and refine needs, zoom in, zoom out, and there's a way to do that. Superseding need, you remember I told you about the branch versus trunk need statement. Here's a good example. Prevent atrial fibrillation is a trunk need statement. If you can do that, you got billions of dollars in revenue, right? But a branch statement is a prevent clot from forming, and then a really sort of a twig need statement is prevent clot from leaving the heart. There could be another one, prevent clot from reaching neurovasculature or whatever, so that you can actually keep zooming in, basically. Here are some of the need statement pitfalls. I'll just quickly mention two general, too specific, zoom levels are not right. It's stuck in current practice, which is embedding current practice. That could be a problem. If it has embedded solution, that gets you stuck with the embedded solution, the current solution. It's based on a negative. You don't want to start, you don't want to have your need statement rooted in a negative statement, basically. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time. Here's some examples, basically, for non-healthcare related pitfalls, basically, or need statement pitfalls. We can review that. You'll have these slides. Early needs validation. Once you have written these needs statements, you want to actually validate them. You want to go back and look at a bit of a sniff test. Are we framing these needs appropriately? Do I need to do a little more research in certain areas? Should I do a little bit of a market size analysis to quickly validate some of these needs? Do I need to talk to some stakeholders and show them the need statement? And they'll say, no, this is completely bogus. That's not what we need. You may get that, right? So you want some early needs validation. And there's a process for that, and I've listed that here. You want, the one thing that I would strongly advise you to do is watch out for expert bias. Thought leaders tend to have very definitive views of something, but that's a problem because sometimes needs are lurking underneath the conventional wisdom. So you want to talk to your broad cross-section of customers rather than just one marquee KOL or key opinion leader or expert, because that expert may definitely tell you to go in a particular direction, but maybe it may miss the depth of the work that you've done before. So watch out for that when you're doing the validation. Need criteria. We talked about need criteria where you really want to have a must-have and a good to have. Must-have is stuff that you absolutely need, and good to have is something that would be good, that would be like bells and whistles, basically. So I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'll just mention that we're going to come back to this need criteria later on as a must-have, good to have. When you start to screen your needs, let's say you are dozens of needs, right? You write in your need statement down in a lot of different ways based on your research, a range of different needs, unless you sort of just narrow down to already 5 or 6, and then you're trying to pick from it. Either way, you want certain things to help you screen these needs. Looking at existing solutions is a critical element because they'll help you figure out how much scope do you have, what's already been done, right? So that's one area. So you want to research all kinds of solutions, and those don't have to be solutions of the kind that you are working on. So, often innovators say, I don't have a competition. Like if you say, do you have a competition? I don't have a competition, because the kind of solution you're developing, that seems to be unique. That seems to be fairly, like, you have a new material that you're developing and nobody else has that material. You say, I don't have a competition because my material is unique. Well, they are using other materials right now, right? Or they may not be using any materials at all. So they may be getting around that in some other ways. So you want to know what are their current practices, what are the current solutions, because your current solutions are your competition. And in fact, they are the hardest to dislodge. Okay. So that's something that you do analysis. You look for gaps in the current solutions. You analyze your existing solutions on these 5 parameters. What's the overview of the landscape? What's the solution profile for each of those solutions? What's the economics around it? How are they being used right now? It's written with the clinical needs in mind, but you can apply this to all types of solutions. What are the new ones that are coming up, and how does it all come together? What's the synthesis of that, basically? I'll skip these slides. Actually, this is. We talked about stakeholder mapping earlier, and the more your understanding of the stakeholder ecosystem and its role on the solutions that, on adoption of the solutions that you're developing is really critical, right? So here's an example of a care pathway or cycle of care for a nephrology need, basically. So that helps them understand who the stakeholders are. You can do a flow of money analysis with them, and that ultimately leads to sort of an output of this kind. This is a lot of work, and I'm not asking you to do this, but I've included all of these slides in case you want to go to them and sort of come up with one for yourself, if those of you who are interested. These are steps in the market analysis that we talked about: the landscape, segmentation, target market, mapping that out on an XY plot, and all of this. No matter what type of need you're working on, what industry, what area that you're focused on, food, materials, aerospace, as an incubator, healthcare, you actually can do this exercise. So these are just for your benefit. Market segmentation, how do you segment the markets? There's some ways of doing it, and some examples that I've included in the slides. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through it in the interest of time because I want to save some time at the end for your needs filtration. There you go. Okay. Okay, so this is the part I want to spend a little bit of time on, need selection. Okay. When you're selecting needs, actually, we all have an intuitive feel to what needs are most important, right? Because we have done the background research, we have talked to our stakeholders, we have done observations. We have a sense of what our needs are. In fact, if you're working on a solution already, which many of you are, you already made that selection, and you made that selection based on your assessment so far. All I'm asking you to do is do a bit of a needs validation. But when you're doing it, the process that you follow, if you did it in a structured way, you first select the factors from to consider when making a decision. I mentioned that at Biodesign, our fellows actually follow sometimes three or four stages of screening. The first screening stage is very, very simple. It's like, who's got the interest in the team? How well our capabilities map onto that need? And is this a big enough problem, right? Those are some of the simple factors that they use. They could get more and more detail in the follow-on things, but the first cut itself is very easy to do. And I would encourage you all to come up with lots of need statements in your area and do at least the first layer of need selection. Because you want to make sure that the need that you have chosen to work on, it doesn't filter out based on that simple criteria. One of you had asked this question: what if the population is small and they cannot pay as much? Should I keep them in? But the only way you're going to know is by doing that structured need selection. Have enough needs in there, and then figure out whether that particular need that only applies to a small population which cannot pay as much. Is that like another parameter that teams often use is urgency of the problem. If you don't solve this problem, how many people are going to die? In case of COVID-19, coming up with a way of isolating patients was an urgent need, right? Even if that isolation mechanism would not pay, and there are a very small number of patients who were infected, it was an urgent need that had a mortality as a potential impact, right? So you basically, urgency of the need becomes a really critical factor in some cases, basically. And then you can assign ratings for those factors. You can combine to create a quantitative score. All of this is as much art as it is science, and then narrow it down. But you always want to do a bit of sniff test with every one of these things, okay? And then you can iterate on that with multiple screens, okay? So that's really the need selection. Here are examples of the kinds of number of needs that our teams actually came up with. This team had 320 needs initially and used basically whether it was duplicate need, it was a big enough market, was it a real need based on what somebody may have said or not said, and whether the team was interested. That allowed them to go from 320 to 120 quickly. Okay. Second set of filters were a weighted formula, like for the market size. They brought a lot more quantitative rigor here. Patient impact. How much of an impact was it going to have on the patient? How much of an impact was it going to have on the customer? Patient in this case is user, and provider in this case is the customer. And basically intuitive. Was it a fit? Was it a fit for their team, right? So that was a second. It took them down to 50 needs. And then they applied the final filter where the weighted formula based on the same parameters, but how unmet was the need? They added a new factor. And how feasible was it to solve it? That brought it down from 50 to 10. So here's just an example of how they approach it. You don't have to approach it that way. You can apply whatever filters. You can have 2-step, 3-step, 1-step, but it's just a way of sort of benchmarking it. I'm going to skip these. Here's a tool that they use. It's you can convert it into an Excel spreadsheet actually. They have an identifier ID for the need. they have a need statement, they have estimated market size. Each of these can be a column, basically. This is a web-based tool that they have developed. But each of these fields basically becomes a factor in screening these need statements. Pretty comprehensive and very rigorous. And they realized that that rigor has helped them avoid picking a need that they generally felt very passionately about. Sometimes what the need that they felt passionately about was not really the right need. So I'm just going to skip these, these nitty-gritties of how you scale them. But you can see how those ratings actually show up in this, and you can do this through Excel spreadsheet. Here's another example of, well, this I'm just going to skip this. This is I didn't talk about this so far, so I'm going to skip it. So he's using a spreadsheet. The other one you saw was a web-based tool. You can use a spreadsheet to do it, and these slides are going to be available to you, so you can see what these columns are that allow you to screen these. So actually, let me show you something interesting. See how they basically had cutoffs basically based on their scores. They had scores and they plotted it, and they basically they graded on the curve. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, grading on the curve. As a professor, we grade on the curve our students who fit within a particular. If there's a step change, that's when you go from A to A minus to B to B plus and so on. This is another example of how they went from high number of needs to 125 to 50 to 15. Talks about different factors. I've included this just as a way of example. You can choose your own factors. Okay, so here's an exercise I want you guys to do now. I want each of you, to come up with 3 need statements. Okay, generally in the area of your need. I asked you to come up with 1 earlier. Now I want you to come up with 3. Do that on your own, and then apply very simple factors. You choose the factors. So is it a big enough problem? Do you have the capability to solve it? Whatever, right? And then use that to pick the top need. So what I want you to do is, in the chat window, I want you to put all 3 needs in the order of priority, 1, 2, 3. And I'll give you 8 minutes to do that. So come up with 3 need statements and then prioritize them based on some filter, simple filter. Don't make it very complex. And don't use weighting factors and so on. Just use your general sense of how each need falls on those 2 or 3 or 4 factors, and then rank out of these needs. I would love to see how you, and you just say 1, 2, 3, and then type that in the chat window.
So, Anurag, suppose a company is, say, looking at energy. There could be a need associated with telecom towers. There could be a need associated with, say, stationary power for townships, storage, and there could be a need associated with, say, cars and so on,
Sure.
right? And they could write a need statement for each of this as they perceive it. That's what you want them to do.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. But sometimes it could be just associated with telecom, and there may be different needs within the telecom market segment that they may be trying to that they could address. When you're innovating around a particular need, you find so many gaps in the marketplace, and you could solve a lot of different problems for a particular customer. So the way what you explained, Premnath, that's exactly what I have in mind. Like if you have lots of different opportunities, lots of different gaps, lots of different unmet needs, you can write needs statements for each of those sectors, or you can, even within a given sector, you could have multiple needs. So you choose which 3. Normally when you do this, you would probably have come up with hundreds of needs, right? But right now I'm only asking you to come up with 3. So you can choose whichever 3 needs statements you can come up with. And then 6 minutes.
We've started getting some answers. Anurag, you want to take them now or later?
I'll take them because I'll move on in
For
5
example,
minutes.
you can take Sayantani's answer.
Yeah, let me take a look. So let's see. A way to perform a point of care test in ladies in order to identify the presence of cervical cancer as a treatable phase so that immediate treatment can be imparted. The second one is a dipstick test. So in the second one, you have actually embedded a solution. That's a solution actually.
Yeah.
So the second one is not really a need statement. The third one is to identify ladies at a treatable phase of, that's an interesting one. And you've chosen the first one as the higher priority, probably because you felt that addressed the maximum number of customers. Probably the market size one might have been a factor. So or you may have felt that the revenue associated with the one versus the third, first versus the third, first one was going to give you more revenues. So I see how you've structured, how you sort of screened that. Wherever do you have additional need statements? So Machu has 2. A way to reduce pollution due to diesel generators in telecom towers by having a green energy storage tech. A way to reduce cost of energy. So one is pollution, one is cost of energy, and you prioritize the reduction of pollution as number one, I guess. I'm guessing that's what you're doing. So what I'm having you all do is get into this habit of not only crafting the need statements, and some of them can improve by the way you've structured it, but not only get in the habit of crafting the problem you're working on as a need statement, just to bring a little discipline for yourselves, but also doing this in a competitive way with other needs, because your time is valuable, your resources are valuable. You don't want to work on something that is not going to give you the best outcome. So you really want to write down as many problems as you are thinking about and then rank them. Like, even if you picked one, I would like you to come up with other need statements and sort of see how they stack up. It's possible that one what you picked is the one that is the right one, but you want to confirm that for yourselves. It's called needs validation, by the way, when you do that. Sandeep had something currently available are uncomfortable and are not user-friendly. You're right, segments based on emerging. You may want to frame that as a need statement, but I see what you've tried to do as a prioritization of those.
Only pose the problem, right? Not
There's no population, there's no outcome there. Agreed. The reasons need statement has stood the test of time last 20 years, why that construct has been so powerful is that it captures everything you need to have before you start to solve that problem. It tells you what the problem is, who's affecting, and what would you accomplish if you solve that problem, or what are you trying to accomplish if you solve that problem. It basically it basically becomes a blueprint for you to then engage in brainstorming and invention. So I just got 2 more minutes. Any other need statements? The 3 need statements that you want to prioritize. Ramji, you had 3: accelerating ambulance network in metro cities to help golden hour, reduce noise pollution by vehicles, assisting pet owners after the death of pets. So these are different needs. And it seems like you're prioritizing the ambulance network because you find that to be the most impactful or most urgent or whatever your parameters you used. So you made that choice, right? You have to make that choice. You have to apply the filters. You have to apply the prioritization framework, but you need to be thoughtful about it. Is the point I'm making. So this is good. Thank you again for humoring me and sort of engaging in this exercise, because hopefully that helped you practice that a little bit. And again, if you can capture this Anmol, that'll be great. If there's a feedback required later on. Okay, so we just talked about coming up with need statements. We talked about having lots of them, and then having a way of finding a way to sort of select those needs. And once you've done that initial need selection, you want to, for the final set of needs, you want to do additional research and you want to iterate on that and you want to validate this with key stakeholders until you have said, I have got it. I know exactly what need I'm working on, why I'm working on it, who the stakeholders are, what am I trying to accomplish, what the contours are, what the market size is. You understand that need so well that when you start to brainstorm around it, you know exactly what you're trying to hit, So, and I'm not going to focus on brainstorming here, obviously, because that's not the focus of this session. But I want to end with one last thing, and then I'll open the floor for conversation. The needs criteria. You want to know what are the must-haves for your need, for the solution that you are going to come up for your need. What are the nice-to-have? What do you need for sure in your solution? What is a must-have, right? And what are some of the good-to-have? So one exercise I want you guys to do is go back to the need statement that you came up with. Tell me one thing that you absolutely must have in the solution. So here's an example where this team basically had a BSI infection in the premature neonates in the umbilical catheters. And they basically said they wanted that infection rate to be below 7.5 infections below for 1,000 patient days. That's the marker that they set for themselves, because they realized that hospitals were having to pay for these infections. These were hospital-acquired infections, and that number was critical for them. So that wasn't must-have. There are other must-have that they have here, and then nice to have. They had safe usage for more than 14 days. That it'll be great if they could use this solution for more than 14 days. Although it was not a must-have. Even if this thing could only be used for a few days or a week or whatever, it would be okay. Must-have was the infection rate should be below 7.1 per 1,000 patient days. So they came up with that must-have, good to have. Here's another example of must-have, good to have. For this particular need, basically the must-have was, remember the point of care diagnostics in dermatology clinic? They basically said it has to be done in less than 10 minutes. They realized that if this point of care diagnostics takes more than 10 minutes, the dermatologist wouldn't want to do it. It takes too much time. It won't give the dermatologist enough revenue. And the patients may not want to be there for that long. They may not want to hang around for longer than that because they're used to being in a dermatology clinic for about 10 minutes. So they wanted to keep it, that was a must-have. Whereas nice to have, interface time should be less than a minute. So basically the thing is, you just sort of, how you measure the temperature with infrared now, beep, beep, and then you call the temperature. So this is the nice to have. But even if it's like all those 10 minutes, you have to interface with the patient to diagnose, that would have been okay. It wasn't a must-have. It's less than 1 minute. So this gives you an example of, what must-have and nice-to-have criteria can be. So here's an exercise I want you all to do. Share with me, just must-have, no nice-to-have. Share with me one must-have in your for your needs. If you solve those need statements, if I solve those needs in your solution, what is that one must-have you would like to have? Good economic value, and you can put in a number. Actually, you can actually make it even more quantitative than that if you want, because that helps when you're doing brainstorming. That helps. Any other must-have? Any other thoughts? Easy to deploy, user-friendly. LCOE less than 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. That's good, very good. Customer satisfaction. So you may want to, Shubhadeep, you may want to put some number there. What does customer satisfaction mean? Like quantify that in some manner. Feel good factor for customer. Again, Ramji, figure out how do you quantify that? How do you measure that? Nitin, sustainable. Try to define that better. That's good. By asking, when I'm asking you to pick that one must-have, you're basically saying, this is whatever I do, my solution must accomplish that. That's like the most important deliverable for your solution. You're choosing. You could have 10 different things you could deliver, but this is like the most important one, right? For your customers must benefit in that manner, right? So you try and quantify it, make it more specific, but pick that must-have. You need to know what that must-have is, and then try not to burden that with a lot of nice-to-have, because you're gonna try, if you try to please too many masters, if you try to come up with a solution that tries to meet a lot of criteria, it's going to be very hard. Be very clear about what you're trying to hit and validate it. Make sure that you are absolutely sure, because if you, part of the reason people actually include a lot of features in their thing, this is a really good example of why Androids versus iPhones. Androids actually have a ton of technology in there, and part of the reason people include a lot of features, a lot of things in their solutions, is because they're worried that some customers may want this, some customers may want that. In the process, they come up with something that is everything for everybody, which sometimes means nothing for anybody. Basically, you want to be very clear about what your solution accomplishes. What is that must-have? Okay. So I'm going to pause here. It's 8:55. This was my last exercise. This is you guys have been great as audience and as students. And we just did this exercise right now, so I'm going to skip this. So let's actually pause here and see if there are any questions that you all have. And maybe if you want to unmute yourselves, or Anmol, if you want folks to be unmuted, I would love to hear their voices if possible.
I think let's go with some of the questions. How do you know you have done enough number of interviews and process observations of your customers, users, and so on?
Great question. I'll give you time. So our fellows spent 3 months doing it. 3 months and hundreds of hours of observations, background research, and interviews, hundreds of hours. For most entrepreneurs who are already engaged in development of a solution, it's very hard to do. If you're starting from scratch, that's what I would recommend. But if you don't have that kind of time, I would encourage you to speak with at least 20 to 30 customers, if that many customers exist. 30 is a good number. You want background research, as many papers as you can find, as much literature you can find. So that there's no limit to that. But in terms of interviews, 30 is a good number, and observations, a subset of those, if you want to do it in a quick way. But otherwise, if you had the time and you had the bandwidth, I would recommend that you do hundreds of hours of that.
Yeah. Can I think Mugdha has put up a feedback form, please fill it up. But there's also somebody's asked about the difference between a problem statement and a need statement. Okay. Mm-hmm. And others are sort of asking if the need statement will be the vision statement and so on. You want to comment on that? But I have a few points. If you don't mind, I'll take a couple of minutes at the end, please. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, so vision statement is really where you ultimately want your organization, your venture to go. So vision statement is very different from the problem statement or need statement. I consider problem statement so need statement is a very specific language that biodesign uses, which has those 3 components. Oftentimes when people are writing problem statements, they just write the problem, the first part of it. Need statement has all 3 of them. So you can call it problem statement or need statement as long as all those 3 parts are there. Those 3 parts, the problem, the population, the outcome that you're desiring, those 3 things. So if you do those 3 things, you can call it whatever you want, but you're good. In the problem statements, typically people only have the problem itself without which population and what the outcome, desired outcome is.
Yeah, I think there is a question from Ashish Perukari. Anmol, can you unmute him?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, please brief. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So my question is purely from an incubator standpoint. So if a lot of these innovators who go primarily for funds, grants and all that, an idea validation I think going by whatever you have said, should be a primary criteria on giving them the grant. But what if that does not take a significant chunk in terms of grading them? How should an incubator go about dealing with it? Because they come with a solution.
Yeah, I think it's a great question actually, and when we are actually looking at we advise a lot of innovators, Stanford Biodesign. Our phase 2 of India Biodesign focuses on that quite a bit. We always look at how well they have articulated their need. Do they really understand the problem they're trying to solve? Because if they haven't done that, you're incubating them and you're putting resources into them, their likelihood of their success will go down. They'll hit road bumps and they'll have to go back to the drawing board. So you want them to articulate their problem, understanding of their problem really, really well. Whether they're doing it through need statements or they are doing it just as this is my problem we're solving. These are our customers. This is what we're trying to accomplish. As long as they talk about those components, even individually, and if they've not done that, if they cannot answer that question, then I would be very, very careful.
Yeah. Anurag, can I ask you a quick question, please? See, there will be many of the incubators and startups, who are actually already have made up their mind on, or are starting from the solution side. In the sense, they have a fancy material at hand, or they have thought up a way by which they can make up a new battery, whatever it is. For them, what would you want to say how they should go about it? Because the reason we started today with need identification as the first thing was actually to reorient them also, because you can have whatever solutions, but at the end of the day you have to sit and work out need identifications, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Premnath. But they shouldn't lose heart that just because they're starting with a solution, they can't use this methodology. In fact, because whatever your solution is, it probably can be deployed in multiple different ways. It can address needs in a lot of different ways, like the materials one. It probably has a bunch of different applications. You want to know your use case. You want to know what use case is your solution going to be most optimal for. So what you need to do is what is called needs validation. So you want to articulate, you want to go back, set aside your solution for a second and articulate what the need is. And you can cheat a little bit by, crafting your need statement because you already know what solution you're working on, but don't embed the solution in that need statement. Okay, have that very clearly laid out what the problem is, what population, what the outcome, and do that write that in multiple different ways, and try and understand where and do that exercise. Go to the customers, go to do the observations, do the research, set aside the solution for a minute, and write that down with the idea that ultimately you're going to try to map your solution onto it. But go through that exercise, okay? And then when you filter it, you can filter it based on how well can you address it. What you will find is that what is your form factor for your material? What sort of cost you want? What sort of manufacturing you need to have? And what sort of packaging do you want? Like all of that, your solution is not just that material. How does that material get used is the solution. It's not your material is not a solution yet. It's just an ingredient of a solution. So for you to come up with the right solution, you really need to understand your needs very, very well. So that's an example.
So I have an example for that from my own experience. I was really fascinated by this method to do yarns, continuous yarns of carbon nanotubes. Okay, and this is something which I spent some time working on. It was exciting. It was a science paper, with the yarn being spun in spools. But the question was, we could never find, at least the limited time I spent on, a particular use case where it would do better than, say, carbon fiber. So we had to dig deeper. Eventually we did find that application, but I'm just trying to say that, it was not about the coolness of the science or the material, but about, finding the use case. And for that, you have to go after needs. And in this case, it was actually a bulletproof vest that it was used for eventually. But the thing is, one had to figure out that you need, and then figure out how the solution connects to that need. And therefore, the need identification, which you talked about today, is absolutely critical to that process, right? Now, another point is how do, when you are doing it with a lot of students and a lot of fellows. And by the way, we have used the same method and borrowed from that for our social innovation fellows who not only work on health, but also work on waste to value and other domains and many other social domains as well. And it's in fact quite nice to see hundreds of need identification statements coming out from the immersion programs where people sit and just observe and then from that filter out what they really want to work on. For a company which has already begun and already on their way, what would you suggest they should, how can they adapt some of these methods? And also for incubator managers, how can they build it into some of their processes in mentoring some of these ideators and startups?
Yeah, I'll take the second one first, the incubators. I would strongly encourage the incubators to not only have this as a criteria in the intake, when you're bringing those incubatees in, ask that question, because if you don't ask, you won't get the answer. And asking itself, that act of interrogation, act of sort of asking them to frame their needs, what problem are you trying to solve, as a really good sort of starting point for these incubatees ultimately, even if they do come in. And then once they are in, I would recommend that they have, and very early on in their incubation, this, the workshops somebody can do with them, an exercise where they actually do go through a needs articulation or needs validation exercise. The sooner they do it, the more likely they are to succeed. So those would be two recommendations I would have for incubators. For those who already have an existing company, you can do, you saw all those cycles going back in the biodesign methodology, and even in the, you heard that talked about in the design thinking video. You can go back to the drawing board every step of the way. Even solutions that have been in the marketplace for a while can actually go back to that. Because when you're in the market, you are actually interacting with the customer, and it gives you data. As more data comes in, as the conditions change, as the context changes, the needs evolve. And there may be a new set of needs that you may be able to address and so on. So I think the needs validation exercise can be done at any stage, whether it's an old company versus new company. I'll give an example. Blockbuster is a video renting chain in the US. It used to be. Blockbuster went out of business because Netflix actually took over their business. If Blockbuster had a design thinking approach to this, they had kept on going back to the needs of their customers, they would have realized the needs are evolving, needs have changed. And what they needed was a newer solution for a newer set of customers. And there was a competitive threat in the form of Netflix. And ultimately they went out of business because they didn't innovate enough. So you really want to, even if you have a solution in motion, you want to constantly ask that question: what is the need that we are trying to solve?
I think a similar comment from Vaibhav as well about continuous need to keep doing this process to stay innovative and agile. But we are also seeing it in practice in startups who hit a wall, sometimes because a customer seems to not really respond as positively as you would think to a particular product, and then you need to go back and rethink some of the needs. And another situation is where the investors are not so keen because they're not excited by the need definition, which you've been working on. And in all these cases, there's a pivoting that is needed, which many of our startups do end up doing, and it comes back again to the need.
All successful startups. There's not a single startup that I know that has not pivoted multiple times. Twitter went through 23 different, based on what I read, 23 different, concepts. They kept on going back to the drawing board. So, overnight successes for startups is a myth. And so completely agree with your point, Premnath. It's you want to continue to sort of assess. I'm actually on the advisory board of another company that focuses on education and high school student sort of population, and they are actually going through that process right now. There are larger unmet need that they've identified is right, but they need to actually define that much more precisely so that they can get their option in the marketplace.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Anurag. I think we should be closing now. Thank you so much for taking this much time out. Also, some of the exercises you've done are terrific, and I think I will request each of the participants to please try it out for your own business or even your incubator, because an incubator also needs to be run professionally as a business as well. Okay.
Yeah.
So Anurag, thank you very much. And Anmol, can we close now? Anmol Mugda?
Yes, Dr. Thank you so much, Dr. Mairal. Was a very impactful session.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Good luck.
Bye-bye. And good night,
Bye.
everybody. Anmol, can you please save the chats?
Yes, I have saved it. But we can also discontinue the YouTube stream.
Anmol, your YouTube has stopped?
Because you are the host, you will have to, you can just left click on the live on YouTube tab and it should close it.
I'm not able to stop it by clicking on it.
Correct. Then we can just end the meeting. End it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll end the meeting.
Thanks.